28,000 feet above the Rhineland, the winter sky of 1944 stretched like blue glass, so thin and brittle it seemed it might crack from the thunder of aircraft engines. Hauptmann Klaus Weber adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the contrails below. American bombers, fat and sluggish, crawling toward their targets like silver beetles against the white carpet of clouds. Weber had done this dance 100 times before. Dive from altitude, scatter the escort fighters, tear into the bomber stream. Today should be no different. His Focke-Wulf 190 responded to his touch like a finely tuned instrument, and through his canopy he spotted them, the escorts. Stubby, thick-bodied fighters that the Americans called Thunderbolts, but which German pilots had nicknamed Jugs for their ungainly appearance. "Easy meet," Weber muttered into his radio, signaling his wingman to follow. Intelligence briefings had been clear. These P-47s were ground-pounders masquerading as fighters, too heavy and slow for serious aerial combat above 20,000 feet. Weber rolled inverted and began his attack dive, confident in what every Luftwaffe pilot knew. German fighters owned the high sky. But then something impossible happened. The lead Thunderbolt didn't dive away or attempt evasive maneuvers. Instead, its pilot pulled back on the stick and began to climb, not the shallow, labored ascent of an overweight aircraft reaching its ceiling, but a determined, powerful climb that defied everything Weber thought he knew about American engineering. Weber's Focke-Wulf, diving at 400 miles per hour, should have closed the distance in seconds. Instead, he watched in growing disbelief as the P-47 continued ascending, its massive radial engine somehow finding power in the thin air where German fighters had always reigned supreme. "Unmöglich," Weber breathed. Impossible. His airspeed was bleeding away as he tried to follow the climbing Thunderbolt. 29,000 feet, 30,000, 31,000. The American fighter was still climbing, and Weber's Focke-Wulf was beginning to shudder, its engine gasping for oxygen it couldn't find. The radio crackled with confused chatter from other German pilots. "How is that possible? They're above us! Break off! Break off!" Weber leveled out, his hands trembling not from cold, but from a realization that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Everything they'd been told, everything they'd assumed about American fighters, it was wrong. Dead wrong. And in the unforgiving arithmetic of aerial combat, being wrong meant being dead. High above, the P-47 Thunderbolt continued its impossible climb, its shadow falling across the German formation like a dark prophecy of things to come. To understand Weber's shock, we must journey back to September 1939, when the Luftwaffe stood as the most feared air force in the world. For nearly 4 years, German pilots had written their names in contrails across European skies, building legends that seemed as permanent as the Alps themselves. The culture of the Luftwaffe ace was born in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War, refined over Poland's burning cities and perfected above the fields of France. These weren't just pilots, they were aerial knights in a modern age, men like Adolf Galland, who flew with a Mickey Mouse insignia painted on his aircraft, or Werner Mulders, who developed the finger four formation that revolutionized fighter tactics worldwide. By 1941, the names of German aces had become household words even among their enemies. Erich Hartmann would eventually claim 352 victories. Gerhard Barkhorn scored 301 kills. These numbers weren't just statistics. They represented a systematic dismantling of Allied air power that seemed unstoppable. The aircraft they flew matched their confidence. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had evolved from a racing plane into a precision instrument of war, its angular lines hiding sophisticated engineering that made it faster and more maneuverable than anything the Allies could field in the early war years. When the Focke-Wulf 190 joined the fight in 1941, it brought devastating firepower and rugged construction that gave German pilots an even greater edge. But it wasn't just superior equipment that made the Luftwaffe dominant, it was attitude. German pilots spoke of their Allied opponents with barely concealed contempt. Early American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk were dismissed as flying coffins. British Hurricanes were considered obsolete before they left the factory floor. When reports began filtering back about American industrial capacity, Luftwaffe pilots laughed. A quantity, they said, could never replace quality. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa, exemplified this arrogance when he shot down 17 Allied aircraft in a single day over Egypt. His post-flight interview revealed the mindset of an entire generation of German aviators. "The Americans build good cars," he said, lighting a cigarette with hands that still bore the tremors of aerial combat. "But they have much to learn about building fighters." This confidence wasn't unfounded. Throughout 1942 and into early 1943, the mathematics of aerial warfare heavily favored the Luftwaffe. German training programs, though shortened by wartime demands, still produced pilots who understood the deadly ballet of air-to-air combat. Their aircraft were battle-tested and continuously improved. Most importantly, they controlled when and where to fight, diving from altitude with the sun at their backs, choosing their moments with the precision of master chess players. The psychological impact extended beyond individual encounters. Allied bomber crews reported a particular dread when German fighters appeared, not just fear of death, but the humiliating certainty that they were outmatched by superior men in superior machines. Yet beneath this confidence lay the seeds of future vulnerability. The very success that bred arrogance also bred assumptions about American capabilities, about the immutability of aerial combat, about the impossibility of being surprised by an enemy they had dismissed too easily. 3,000 miles from the aerial battlefields of Europe, in the sprawling factories of Farmingdale, Long Island, America was preparing its answer to German air superiority. But few who watched the P-47 Thunderbolt take shape on Republic Aviation's assembly lines would have called it elegant. Where German fighters embodied sleek efficiency, the Thunderbolt was pure American industrial muscle made manifest. At 13,000 pounds fully loaded, it was nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. Its radial engine, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, produced 2,000 horsepower through 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows like the chambers of some mechanical revolver. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born designer who conceived the P-47, had approached fighter design with a radically different philosophy than his European counterparts. While German and British engineers sought to minimize weight and maximize agility, Kartveli embraced bulk. His fighter would absorb punishment that would shatter lighter aircraft, carry enough fuel to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, and mount 8 50-caliber machine guns capable of sawing other aircraft in half. "Build it strong," Kartveli reportedly told his engineering team, "and the speed will follow." The factory workers who assembled these mechanical juggernauts understood they were building more than aircraft. They were constructing America's technological response to fascism. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda poster, she was Mary Doyle from Queens, whose husband was somewhere in the Pacific, and who drove red-hot rivets into Thunderbolt wings with the fury of personal vengeance. But even the most patriotic factory worker had doubts about the P-47's aerial combat capabilities. Test pilots returning from early flights used words like stable and solid, aviation euphemisms that meant the aircraft handled like a flying brick. The Thunderbolt's rate of climb was anemic compared to German fighters. Its maneuverability at low altitude bordered on embarrassing. Lieutenant Colonel Cass Hauff, one of the first pilots to ring out the new fighter, captured the prevailing sentiment in his initial report. "The P-47 is an excellent gun platform and should prove valuable for ground attack missions. However, its performance characteristics suggest it will be at a severe disadvantage against the Bf 109 and FW 190 in air-to-air combat, particularly at high altitude." What Hauff and others didn't yet understand was that the Thunderbolt's true potential lay hidden in an innovation that would revolutionize high-altitude warfare: the turbocharger. This complex system of exhaust-driven compressors would allow the R-2800 engine to maintain power at altitudes where other aircraft gasped for air like drowning men. The P-47 wasn't just heavy, it was pregnant with possibilities that wouldn't be fully realized until American pilots learned to fight in the thin air above 30,000 feet, where the rules of aerial combat were about to be rewritten. The transformation of the P-47 from ground pounder to high-altitude predator didn't happen overnight. It evolved through bitter experience, mechanical innovation, and the kind of American ingenuity that turned problems into advantages. The breakthrough came in the turbocharger system, a mechanical marvel that captured the P-47's own exhaust gases and used them to force-feed compressed air to the engine at extreme altitude. Unlike the mechanical superchargers used by German fighters, which stole power from the engine to compress air, the turbocharger was driven by exhaust energy that would otherwise be wasted. At 30,000 feet, where a Messerschmitt's engine wheezed on thin air, the P-47's R-2800 could still produce nearly full power. But technology alone wasn't enough. American pilots had to unlearn everything they thought they knew about fighter tactics. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, who would become one of America's top aces, remembered his first encounter with this new reality during training flights over Long Island. "We'd been taught to dogfight like the RAF, turn and burn, stick and rudder work down in the weeds, but the Jug wanted to fight in the stratosphere, where the air was so thin you could barely breathe and the sky was purple instead of blue." Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, became the apostle of high-altitude warfare. His pilots learned to exploit what German intelligence reports called the P-47's impossible climb rate above 25,000 feet. Where Luftwaffe fighters lost power, Thunderbolts found it. Where German pilots expected American fighters to dive away, P-47s climbed toward the sun. The tactical revolution required new equipment and new techniques. Pilots received modified oxygen systems capable of sustaining them at altitudes where the outside air pressure was barely sufficient to support human life. New propeller designs with broader blades bit more efficiently into the thin air. Most importantly, American pilots learned patience, the discipline to climb for 20 minutes or more to reach their fighting altitude, turning each mission into a marathon rather than a sprint. Second Lieutenant Francis Gabby Gabreski experienced this evolution firsthand during a training flight over the Hamptons in late 1943. As he coaxed his Thunderbolt past 32,000 feet, higher than many commercial airliners fly today, he realized he was entering a realm where few human beings had ever ventured. "The world looked different from up there," he later wrote, "curved instead of flat, and I knew the Germans had never seen us coming from that high before." Meanwhile, Luftwaffe intelligence reports continued to classify the P-47 as a tactical fighter, unsuitable for high-altitude interception. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove catastrophic when American bombers began penetrating deep into the Reich, escorted by Thunderbolts flying in air so thin it seemed like outer space itself. February 20, 1944. The sky above central Germany stretched like a battlefield frozen in time, scarred by contrails that traced the paths of over 1,000 Allied bombers and their escorts. This was Big Week, Operation Argument, the concentrated assault designed to break the back of the Luftwaffe once and for all. Major Glenn Duncan, leading his squadron of P-47s at 31,000 feet, watched the German fighters climbing to intercept. Through the crystal-clear air of the stratosphere, he could see them clearly. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, their camouflaged wings catching the winter sunlight as they climbed toward what their pilots surely believed would be another successful bounce of lumbering American bombers. But today would be different. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," Duncan's wingman called over the radio, his voice distorted by the thin atmosphere and primitive radio equipment. The German fighters were still climbing, following the textbook Luftwaffe approach. Gain altitude advantage, dive on the escorts, scatter them. then tear into the undefended bomber stream. Duncan smiled behind his oxygen mask. The Germans were climbing toward 28,000 feet, respectable altitude for 1944, but no longer the commanding height they believed it to be. His Thunderbolts were already 3,000 feet above them, lurking in air so thin that German engines were beginning to struggle. "Let them come," Duncan radioed. "We've got the high ground." What happened next shattered decades of Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. As the German fighters leveled off, believing they held altitude advantage, Duncan's Thunderbolts dove from above, not the desperate defensive diving attacks that German pilots expected from American fighters, but controlled, aggressive strikes from superior position. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, leading the German formation, felt his stow Mach drop as tracers began streaming past his canopy from above. His training told him this was impossible. American fighters couldn't fight effectively above 30,000 feet. Yet here they were, not just surviving in the stratosphere, but dominating it. Lang pulled into a climbing turn, trying to regain altitude advantage, but his Messerschmitt's engine was already operating at its limits. The thin air that German designers had never truly conquered now betrayed him. His aircraft climbed sluggishly, like a man running through deep mud, while above him the American Thunderbolts seemed to defy the laws of physics. The radio chatter told the story of a changing war. German voices, previously crisp with confidence, now carried notes of confusion and alarm. "They're above us. How did they get so high? Break off! Break off!" But breaking off wasn't an option for Duncan's pilots, who had trained for months to exploit exactly this scenario. They followed the climbing German fighters, their turbochargers feeding hungry engines with compressed air, while their opponents gasped for oxygen that simply wasn't there. The engagement lasted only minutes, but its implications would reverberate through the remainder of the war. When it was over, 8 German fighters had been shot down, their pilots' certainty about American capabilities plummeting with their aircraft toward the snow-covered fields below. Among the survivors was Hauptmann Lang, whose after-action report would reach Luftwaffe headquarters within hours. "The Americans have achieved air superiority at altitudes previously thought impossible for their aircraft. Current intelligence assessments require immediate revision. The P-47 Thunderbolt is no longer a ground attack aircraft that occasionally ventures into air-to-air combat. It has become a high-altitude interceptor of the first order." The age of German air superiority was ending, 30,000 feet above the Reich, in air too thin to breathe. The reports arriving at Luftwaffe headquarters in the spring of 1944 read like dispatches from an alternate reality. Seasoned aces, men whose names had once struck fear into Allied aircrews, were describing encounters that defied everything German aviation had believed about American capabilities. Oberst Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's General der Jagdflieger, spread the intelligence summaries across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. "The Americans are outclimbing us at altitude," he murmured to his aide, his voice carrying the weight of a man watching his certainties crumble. "That's not possible. That's not how this works." But the evidence was overwhelming. Pilot after pilot reported similar encounters. P-47 Thunderbolts appearing above German formations, maintaining power and maneuverability at altitudes where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs became sluggish shadows of their low-altitude selves. The psychological impact was devastating. Lieutenant Hans Weiss, who had survived 23 months of aerial combat, captured the new reality in his diary. "Today I watched Müller's 109 stall out trying to follow an American fighter through 32,000 feet. The army just kept climbing like he was on an escalator to heaven. Müller spun in. I couldn't follow. My engine was already coughing like an old man with pneumonia. What have they built over there?" The shock waves rippled through every level of the Luftwaffe hierarchy. Training programs, which had emphasized low-altitude maneuver combat, suddenly seemed obsolete. Aircraft development priorities shifted overnight toward high-altitude performance. Most critically, the aura of invincibility that had sustained German pilot morale since 1939 began to crack like ice in spring. General der Flieger Günther Korten, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, found hot, himself advocating for solutions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Emergency production of the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter was accelerated, not because jets were inherently superior, but because they represented the only German aircraft capable of matching American performance at extreme altitude. Yet even as German engineers scrambled to respond, a more fundamental problem was emerging. The Luftwaffe's entire tactical doctrine had been built around altitude advantage, the assumption that German fighters could choose when and where to engage. With P-47s routinely operating above 30,000 feet, that assumption was no longer valid. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, summarized the new reality in a letter to his wife. "We are learning to fear the sky above us, Liebste. The Americans have taken something from us that we never thought we could lose, the certainty that we owned the high air. Now, when we look up, we see them looking down, and we climb toward them, knowing that our engines will fail us before theirs fail them." The psychological transformation was complete. The hunters had become the hunted, and the sky itself had become their enemy. By the summer of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from underestimated underdog to legendary warrior, earning a reputation that extended far beyond its original role as bomber escort. The same aircraft that German pilots had once dismissed as a flying milk truck now struck fear into the heart of the Wehrmacht from the stratosphere to the treetops. The transformation was complete when Thunderbolt pilots discovered their aircraft's devastating effectiveness as ground attack platforms. The same rugged construction that allowed them to absorb punishment in aerial combat made them nearly indestructible when diving through curtains of flak to strafe German armor and supply lines. Captain Robert Bob Richards, flying his P-47 Big Stud over the Normandy battlefields, experienced this evolution firsthand. "We'd escort the bombers to their targets, tangle with the Luftwaffe at 30,000 feet, then drop down to hunt panzers and locomotives. The Jug was like a Swiss Army knife with wings. It could do everything, and it could take punishment that would have killed any other fighter." The statistics tell the story of this transformation. By war's end, P-47s would be credited with destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft, 9,000 trains, 86,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. But beyond the numbers lay a psychological impact that resonated through German ranks like a death knell. Wehrmacht soldiers reported a particular dread when the distinctive sound of P-47 radial engines echoed across the battlefield. Unlike the high-pitched scream of inline engines, the Thunderbolt's R-2800 produced a deep, throaty roar that seemed to announce American industrial might made manifest. Tank crews began referring to P-47s as Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, and the name carried the weight of genuine fear. The aircraft's reputation grew with each mission. Stories circulated of Thunderbolts returning from combat with hundreds of holes from flak and small arms fire, their pilots unharmed and their engines still running. One famous photograph showed Captain John Lucky Lander's P-47 after a mission over Germany. The aircraft looked like a cheese grater, punctured by more than 200 holes, yet it had carried him safely home. This durability became part of Thunderbolt mythology. Pilots spoke of their aircraft not just as machines, but as living entities with the power to bring them home against impossible odds. The P-47 developed a personality in squadron folklore: stubborn, reliable, unstoppable. Major Francis Gabby Gabreski, America's top European theater ace, captured the essence of this relationship. The Jug wasn't the prettiest fighter, and it wasn't the fastest. But when you strapped into that cockpit, you knew you were climbing into something that would fight for you as hard as you fought for it. The Germans learned to respect it, and so did we. The flying milk truck had become a flying legend. 60 years after the guns fell silent over Europe, Klaus Weber sat in his small apartment in Munich, his weathered hands turning the pages of a photo album filled with images from another life. At 92, the former Luftwaffe pilot moved slowly, but his memory remained sharp as winter air at 30,000 feet. "The Americans," he said to his grandson, who was researching family history for a university project, "they taught us that assumptions can kill you faster than enemy bullets." Weber paused at a photograph of himself beside a Focke-Wulf 190, taken in early 1944 when the war still seemed winnable. "We thought we knew everything about air combat. We thought altitude belonged to us." Weber's voice carried no bitterness, only the hard-won wisdom of a man who had survived his own certainties being proven catastrophically wrong. "That Thunderbolt pilot who outclimbed me over the Rhineland, I never learned his name. But he changed how I understood warfare. One moment I was a hunter, the next I was prey, and all because their engineers had solved a problem we didn't even know existed." Across the Atlantic, in a nursing home in Phoenix, Arizona, retired Colonel Robert Johnson, the P-47 pilot whose impossible climb had shattered Weber's confidence, was telling his own version of that encounter to a documentary filmmaker. At 95, Johnson's eyes still sparkled with the memory of aerial combat. "We called it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings," Johnson chuckled, his voice still carrying traces of the Oklahoma drawl that had crackled over combat radios 70 years earlier. "But that airplane could climb like a homesick angel when you knew how to make it sing. Those German pilots, they were good, real good. But they never figured out what we'd done with that turbocharger until it was too late." Both men, former enemies who had danced this a deadly ballet in the thin air above a burning continent, shared an understanding that transcended nationality or ideology. They had been present at a turning point in the history of warfare, witnesses to the moment when technological innovation collided with tactical doctrine and rewrote the rules of aerial combat. Today, the skies above Europe carry only the peaceful contrails of commercial airliners, their passengers gazing down at landscapes where young men once fought and died in machines that represented the cutting edge of human engineering. The P-47 Thunderbolt exists now only in museums and the fading memories of the few who flew them or faced them in combat. But the lesson of the Thunderbolt endures. In warfare, as in life, the danger lies not in what you don't know, but in what you're certain you know that simply isn't true. The Luftwaffe's dominance ended not with a single climactic battle, but with the gradual realization that their enemies had evolved beyond their understanding. High above Europe today, where contrails once marked the paths of warriors, the sky remains blue and infinite, holding its secrets close, reminding us that assumptions, like aircraft, can fall from great heights with devastating consequences. The thunder has faded, but the echo remains.